First thing in building your defence is to name your enemy, which is China, of course. Now, you may have seen this slide before, but it's very important because China intends to attack the civilised world when they only provide about 60% of their plant protein they base their whole agricultural system on. And the other 40% is mostly soybeans imported, as per this graphic. So what you see on the bar on the left, the column on the left, is the millions of tonnes involved per grain type in soybeans, and the column on the right is the proportion of total Chinese consumption represented by those grains. So soybeans are 36% protein, wheat's 8 to 10% or up to 12%, and thus those 100 million tonne per annum soybeans is 36% of Chinese agricultural production or consumption, which goes into pigs and chicken, and therefore they can have meat in their diet. Now, they used to live on a purely almost plant-based diet. I remember reading about the lives of coal miners in northeast China in the 1990s, and they only ate meat twice a year. So they are quite a fragile country in a number of ways, but the primary one is the reliance upon imported grain, which can be easily interdicted tens of thousands of kilometres away from China itself, if anybody wants to. But Xi Jinping, the president or chairman of China, the dictator of China, is very keen on having a war with his name on it, because that's how he can go down in history as the new Yellow Emperor of China. So, not phased, they've got a new battle planned, and Ukraine war upset his original plans. They thought it'd be over in a few days and everything be back to normal. But he realises now that he's got to settle down for perhaps years in which there are no grain ships turning up in China's ports. So the solution is to go vegetarian again for the duration of the war. They'll also increase grain production by 50 million tonnes, and they've got agreement with Russia to ship grain across the Siberian Railway, and that might be good for another 50 million tonnes. So they only go partly vegetarian, the better off and well connected will still get some meat during his war. They've also hired 80,000 agricultural inspectors to go around rural China and rip up orchards and bamboo groves and anything else that could be repurposed for growing grain. Now, how do we know definitely that war is coming? Because the Chinese recently spent the equivalent of 7 billion Australian dollars building a grain belt around Chengdu in Western China. And just recently they ripped it all up to put 40,000 hectares back under the plough, and by my calculations at their average yield of 6 metric tonnes of grain per annum per hectare, that'll be another 250,000 tonnes. So they're happily just destroy $7 billion worth of infrastructure they just built so they can have his war. And China is also a structurally poor country. We're told that there are 1,300 million people who are now sort of middle income and they're going to conquer the world, but that's only 300 million of them, 6 coastal provinces that have an income of about 30,000 US per annum. And there's 1 billion people out in the rural China who still live in extreme poverty, including 600 million who have an income of less than 141 US dollars a month. So their standard of living has to be subsidised by the people in the 300 million in the coastal provinces. And a big chunk of their grain production is rice planted by hand. In fact, there are 425 million agricultural workers in China, and thus one agricultural worker only feeds another 2 Chinese. Whereas here in WA, for instance, where we've got farms, individual farms that produce 100,000 tonne per annum of wheat, you've got individual farmers feeding effectively 25 to 40,000 other people through the grain production. If they don't mechanise rice production, they will remain inherently poor. Also, their coal production, we're just about the peak of Chinese coal production. They were a cheap source of labour, but what this graph shows, and that diagram, is that the surface coal in China down to 600 metres is about 80% depleted. To 1,000 metres, it's 60% depleted. And I can tell you that mining beyond 1,000 metres to 1,500 is going to be very difficult. And also the coal miner death rate in China has gone up just recently because they're going flat out, and coal mine operators are not prosecuted now that if they have deaths on their property, because they want to maximise coal production. Because coal is another thing that's going to be running short. They import 500 million tonne per annum of coal now, which will be cut off, particularly the southern provinces where there are no coal mines, and therefore they have to have a stock of coal to keep producing power. Another sign that war is coming to East Asia, and thus ourselves, is this graph produced updated monthly by the Japanese Foreign Ministry. And you'll see that Chinese incursions into Japanese territorial waters around the Senkakus picked up immediately that Xi Jinping became the dictator of China back in 2012. The red vertical bars are into the territorial waters of Japan, and the blue line is incursions into the contiguous area, which is another 12 kilometres out. But you can see a couple of trends there, and if I was interpreting that as a stock chart, I would say that it looks like it just wants to break up. Who's arraigned against China? Well, there's China in the bottom corner. They're at 15% of the world's GDP. Here are the other groups. There's the Western countries, basically the OECD, plus India and East Asia, who are anti-China. And then there's the rest of the world who are indifferent, which is 25%. But they're certainly still outgunned in GDP terms. And this is looking at East Asia in more detail, with the United States as the left-hand column, the Asian countries surrounding Japan, from Japan down to India, and China itself, and then Russia. Russia is about the same size as Australia's economy, believe it or not, even though they've got 130 million people and we've got about 28 now. But if you look at the China graph, that bar, the top $1 trillion of that 15 trillion US is all the people on less than 141 US dollars a month. They can't be expected to do much in a war. Exports are 15%, that'll disappear in a war also. You can only ship a certain amount across Asia and Europe by train. And then there's the construction industry, which has grown to be about 30% of Chinese GDP. Now, property prices are now falling in China because they're overbuilt, and there's 65 million unoccupied apartments, which are now going to rot because there's nobody to live in them. And so that's over. So we're really only fighting, when we do fight with them, about half of their GDP, 7.5 trillion US. We're about 1.5. We alone could keep China at bay at this distance from China, if you didn't think we're going to be subject to nuclear blackmail, that is. Here's another good sign of China retreating, or at least shrinking a bit. This is Chinese industrial plant utilisation, which peaked out post-COVID at 78.4%, and it's now down to 73.6%, a drop of 5% in a couple of years, and that is an ongoing trend, and it's very hopeful. Now, China has also been described as a giant open-air prison, and in which the warders are afraid of the inmates. And there's a sign of that recently. In last month, there was a statue of a Chinese hero called Li Jingjing in Beijing, and it got removed. And that's because Li Jingjing overthrew the corrupt Ming dynasty in 1604 or something like that. And so that's a permanent reminder that corrupt regimes can be overthrown, and the Communist Party of China doesn't like that idea being available to the Chinese people. Also, we don't want China to win because, just for your amusement, this is what happened in rural China last week, southern rural China. A booster rocket from their space program almost fell on a village. That's it spewing out orange hypergolic fluid on the left, which burns through everything. Hypergolic fuel is two liquids which instantaneously combust when combined. And that's the booster sitting on a road in rural China. Although another interpretation of that is that perhaps we are too strict in our industrial safety, and we could relax it somewhat given that rate of people getting hurt in even a country of 1,300 million people isn't very high. And here's another sign that China may go to war, believe it or not. The internet right at the moment, at least my feed, is full of ads promoting China as a cultural destination. But that's also an attempt by the Chinese government to get as much money in as possible. That's a sign that they're short of money, which is destabilising, because if they've got no way out and you want to keep nationalism going to justify your dictatorship, the alternative is to go to war, even though you don't have a good chance of winning. Why Taiwan will fight? It'll be the same as Ukraine. The captured Russian documents at the beginning of that war in Ukraine, the Russian government had planned to kill off the elite in Ukraine, subject to the rest to reprogramming. And the same will be true of Taiwan. The Taiwanese elite will be eliminated, and everybody will have to spend an hour a day studying Xi Jinping thought. If we're just sending everybody on the mainland, everybody in the Communist Party and the armed forces has to study Xi Jinping thought for half an hour a day and answer a question at the end of their online session. So you can't fake your way through this training, and it'll just drive people bonkers having to study that and waste their day. But at the bottom, more usefully, I've got the windows of the weather windows for invading Taiwan. We're just about the beginning of the last third of the main one. I don't think they're going to do it now, and there's another month coming in of October. Other than that, you could be subject to storms which would disrupt things significantly. Now, whether or not Taiwan is going to be the first country that China attacks is moot, in that Ursula von der Leyen, the EU, recently met with Xi Jinping, and he claimed that the US was trying to trick him into invading Taiwan. Xi, a couple of months ago, visited Vietnam at short notice, and proposed a toast to the Vietnamese chairman at dinner, who just shrugged his shoulders sort of and just turned sideways. So there's no love lost between Vietnam and China. And whether there's deception is a big thing in Chinese military planning, whether he wants to tell porkies in public so it gets misinterpreted. But China has laid a lot of concrete for the invasion of Vietnam, and this is a base in southern China, only 10 kilometres from the border. You never see any people associated with it. It's packed too close together to be a commercial enterprise. Also, the roofs are red corrugated steel, whereas the rest of the region is blue, which telling you that this is a centrally commanded construction, and the materials came out of from outside the province to make it. And when I started looking at this place many years ago, those original ones in the middle were bright red. They faded enough, but they keep adding more buildings to the facility, and this is so they can hide armoured troops that come up overnight, hide in be out of satellite coverage in those buildings. You can see where the troops will be barracked in the middle, and they're only 10 kilometres from the borders. Now, what's of interest here to us, especially things happening in the Philippines at the moment, the Second Thomas Reef, is the 7 bases that the Chinese have built in the South China Sea and the Spratlys. They're 1,000 kilometres from the Chinese mainland, from support, which is about the combat range of a Su-35, Su-34, etc., or any type of flanker. And that passage passes Vietnam within a couple of 100 kilometres. That's easily interdicted. The Chinese will waste a lot of effort into defending those bases, which will draw all their forces away from North Asia if they're fighting the Japanese. So they've set themselves up for failure by having those bases there. A lot of people aren't aware of just how many bases there are in the South China Sea. There's 45 Vietnamese bases alone. There's about half a dozen Filipino ones, Malaysian, and the others. Taiwan's got a couple of bases, one base. But these are some of the Vietnamese bases. And for that one on the right-hand corner, there are at least 10 like that there. So I've put here on this slide these bases, tiny little bases with a minimal footprint and with mutual fire support. So they originally built base on the left with little arms coming out, and then sometime later they built one 100 metres away, all with the same structural style, with a concrete walkway between. And here's another 5 of them. But when the war starts, each of these little bases will have its own fate, being subject to Chinese missiles and 152mm shells. And we should pray for them, for they're also protecting us, soaking up Chinese effort in the South China Sea. And this is the bottom Petley Island, one of those bases. And so you can see in the middle foreground is a circular concrete structure just above sea level. That's so they can fire down into the water. And you can see also that there's steel stakes out on the reef line to stop vessels crossing the reef, attacking them at high tide. The Vietnamese have got a lot of experience over decades of close quarters combat, and thus this is probably the ideal shape for defending yourself. And the photos of them have a lot of dogs on these little structures, which probably is a security system, so they can't be taken, special forces can't sneak up on them at night. Now, a funny thing about China and Vietnam, the Vietnamese hate China viscerally. China started invading Vietnam in 116 BC. They've been doing it on and off for thousands of years. So there's a big race memory in Vietnam of Chinese invasions. And when China was only 10 times bigger than Vietnam economically, the Vietnamese weren't too concerned. They knew they could fight that Chinese invasion off. But when Deng Xiaoping opened up China and the economy started growing rapidly from year 2000, with accession to the World Trade Agreement, the Vietnamese started getting concerned, so they had to open up their economy. Bear in mind that both countries are communist state-controlled, centrally commanded economies, and thus subject to very low efficiency. But anyway, the Vietnamese started growing at 7 to 10% per annum economically, and they could afford more. So what they did recently, starting late last year, was putting in cutter suction dredges on some of their bases in the South China Sea and building up these islands, which were little tiny things. I don't know if you can see, so in the top left-hand corner, there's a green blob at the bottom right of that picture, which was the original island that they built their base on. Now they're a lot larger. In fact, the one on the top right is now 4 kilometres long, which would make it suitable for a larger aircraft to take off from if they wanted to build an airfield out of it. But that's the law of unintended consequences, that every action has a reaction. China opening up forced Vietnam to open up, so Vietnam can now afford to fight off China. Which led to this statement from Xi Jinping in March this year, where he said, the armed forces should coordinate the preparation for maritime conflicts, which is interpreted to mean there'll be a war in the South China Sea to get rid of the Vietnamese, because them building their bases up means that they don't believe in the 9-dash line of China's, and that there will be a fight if China wants to be taken seriously in its claims in the South China Sea. And also there are some signs that the Japanese have stirred themselves, and thus they want to base tripwire troops in the Philippines. And the Philippines has stated what will start a war in the South China Sea, which is the death of one Filipino soldier. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an attack by the Chinese on the Filipino resupply attempt at Second Thomas Shoal. They attacked with knives and axes. One Filipino sailor lost a thumb in that, but it's not enough to start a war where the US joins in. This is Second Thomas Shoal. It was a landing ship tank built in 1944 up the Mississippi River somewhere, and then it served in the Pacific, and then again in Vietnam. And in 1973, when the fall of South Vietnam, it ended up in the Filipino Navy with a whole lot of refugees on board. And then in 1998, they ran it up on the reef at Second Thomas Shoal to be a quick and dirty base. And there are 12 Filipino Marines who live permanently in that rotting structure as it falls away underneath them. But they have to be resupplied, and the Chinese are really upset that the Philippines hasn't given up on Second Thomas Shoal yet. This is one of the recent resupply attempts in March, and that's a view out of the deck of a Filipino resupply boat. And what you see there is a cannon of water, which is just about to hit that glass, and a couple of frames on, that glass shatters, and 4 of the people in the deck get injured. In one way, China's a bit topsy-turvy. Most countries have a coast guard to safeguard life at sea. The Chinese have inverted that. So what you see here is a 12,000-ton Chinese Coast Guard cutter, which is 2,000 tons heavier than the biggest US destroyer, and solely designed to ram other countries' Coast Guard ships and sink them. So the Chinese calculate that using this vessel they can sink Coast Guard ships up to 5,000 tons without being damaged themselves. Couple of incidents relating to Australian defence personnel. On the 18th of November last year, HMS Toowoomba was in Japan's exclusive economic zone. They got a fishing net tied up in their propellers, so they sent divers over to clear of it, and they told the vessels in the vicinity, don't come near us, we've got divers overboard. So the Chinese sent a destroyer up to blast our divers in the water with sonar. Apparently they are not permanently damaged by this experience, but it was certainly a nasty thing to do. And then there was another one the year before where a P8 Poseidon was north of Darwin, so to speak, in that part of the world, 60 kilometres off the coast. 2 Chinese vessels, one fired an industrial grade, military grade laser to try to blind the pilots. A word of warning in that just about every Chinese vessel and a probably army unit is equipped with lasers for blinding enemy troops. So there are things called laser resistant sunglasses, and everybody in the combat zone should be wearing them day and night, because you never know when you're going to get hit by a laser from a couple of kilometres away and get blinded. Let's tell a story about Johnson South Reef. Back in 88, 76 Vietnamese sailors were standing on Johnson South Reef, claiming it for Vietnam. A couple of Chinese vessels approached and shot them all up with 20 to 30 millimetre cannon fire and killed them all. And that's portrayed in the top right-hand corner of that. And this is what's happened thereafter. So the Chinese gaining possession of Johnson South Reef by killing the Vietnamese, 76 of them, have built a base on it. And on the left-hand side, you see a satellite view of the island with the base being built. The island's atoll is about 4 kilometres long, and that base is about 400 metres square. The right-hand side of that graphic, see flak towers making a return after 70 years. Those hexagonally things in the corners of it are to fire down on the approaching enemy. But what's quite also interesting is that just next to the top one on the right, you see a ramp going up to the first floor. And this is a style common to all those smaller bases in the Spratlys of the Chinese. Seemingly, there are no entrances at ground level around these bases. They're afraid of being attacked and overcome at night. So the only way in is up that ramp and through that building, and then you can travel further into it. And this is another island on Corduron Reef that gives you an understanding of their structural style. The structure immediately on the front at the left is a close-in weapon system. You can see that under that round dome would be a radar, and then there's a 20 to 30 millimetre radar-guided weapon system. And there's one on the opposite corner of the island, also with the main structure, where they all live. Here's a good example of Gaven Reef, another Chinese fort that they built, with 4 flak towers on the corners. I put the scale there, it's 100 metres across, and you see the ramp at the southern end of the structure. And they're only 15 kilometres away from Namib Island, which the Vietnamese are now expanding, so they'll be able to have a ding-dong artillery battle at some stage. There are 3 atolls in which the Chinese have built substantial bases with 3,000 metre long runways, and this is one at Mischief Reef with plenty of aprons and covered parking and for the fighter aircraft. This is also Mischief Reef, which the harbour is 8 kilometres along. It's quite a substantial port, and there's a lot of concrete structures in these Chinese bases. This is Fiery Cross Reef. This is the north east end, and to the west, to the left here on this, is a 3,000 metre long runway. You see a lot of communication facilities, and that's all artificial. What they're sitting on is completely artificial. And that's the runway at Fiery Cross Reef, with a plane for scale against the size of the accommodation. And what I believe we should do as soon as the war starts, whoever fronts up, is to sink every Chinese ship in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It's not overly difficult, you just got to have the resources to do it and plan to do it. And then I also believe that we should have a peace conference now, before the war starts, to say how it's going to end. And what we should announce is that those bases they have in the Spratlys, at least, will be divided amongst the Allied forces. And I put a tentative list here. Vietnam would get Fiery Cross Reef and Corduron Reef, for instance. And this puts the idea in the mind that those bases are at severe risk, and they will divert forces away from Taiwan or wherever else they are fighting Vietnam on the mainland in order to protect those islands, which are militarily, once the airfields aren't working, are completely useless to them. How that will be, that's the location of those reefs relative to Palawan Island in the Philippines, and that's the 200-kilometre bar at the bottom of the graphic. The US, one of the bases they've acquired from got access to, they'll actually have to build it themselves, from the Philippines, is just next to Bagsak Island. There's some flat islands at the bottom of the Palawan, which will probably be the main base that they can operate out of. What is the US Marine Corps doing about China? What they've done is they've parked up all their tanks, most of their artillery, and they've decided their role will be to support the US Navy in the Western Pacific, and they're going to do that by having a minimal footprint. Probably got to move every 4 hours because these days you can be traced very easily electronically, to the extent of removing the cabs from their trucks. So what that is in the photo is an unmanned vehicle. It's controlled by a bloke standing around it with a joystick type thing, firing a NASA missile. And the origin of that missile is that Kongsberg, the Norwegian weapons maker, said, well, if the F-35 is going to be the dominant fighter in the Western Air Forces, therefore anything that it fires in stealth, while the F-35 can remain at stealth, has to fit in the 4-metre long bomb bay of the F-35. So they said to themselves, well, if we make a cruise missile that fits in the bomb bay of the F-35, we'll have the market to ourselves. And so they did. And it's been reasonably successful. Apparently it's quite survival missile in terms of approaching the enemy ships and their anti-missile attempts. But it's only got a range of 200 kilometres. If it's ground launched, 500 kilometres. If air launched, it's only a little thing with a little warhead. And if you're letting the enemy get within 200 kilometres these days, you've lifted a bit late. The spiritual battle. What does the Bible say about the coming war with China? Well, Revelation 12:3 says, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads, and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. So what has 7 heads? It's the standing committee of the Chinese Politburo, which in 2009, the number of members of that committee was reduced from 9 to 7, no doubt to properly align with biblical prophecy. The Bible also has a prediction about what's going to happen in our war with China. Further on, Revelation 12:9, and the great dragon was cast out, which means that China gets defeated. In terms of spirituality within China, there's been an increase, 300% increase in young people attending temples and lighting joss sticks and trying to reconnect, because the Chinese Communist Party goes out of its way to destroy any religious structure that doesn't have a tourist purpose as well. And revenge on society attacks have increased, where Chinese driving a car will suddenly plough into the pedestrians on the footpath just to get over their own problems created by lack of agency as individuals. Well, a lot has been said about the Ukraine war, and more recently there's been the rise of FPV drones. Ukraine has actually showed the importance of artillery. It's showed the importance of tanks. Active protection systems haven't been trialled yet in Ukraine war. Let's go through a few of the systems. You may have seen some of this before, but what I want to concentrate from is the cost effectiveness. So the last number in that side panel is the dollar cost in US dollars per kilometre per kilo delivered to the enemy. And through using scanners at that cost that they have in operating cost of making the things in Russia at the moment, it's $8.57 to deliver a kilo of explosive or warhead 500 kilometres. Now the scanners can't get shot down, but they can only make 40 a month. And interestingly, they tried doing a sniping Zelensky with the Greek Prime Minister in Odessa a few months ago, but it landed a couple hundred metres away from them. Now, caliber missiles, we've found now that Ukraine can shoot just about all of them down. And therefore, if you think you're going to approach the Chinese fleet with something that looks like that, the traditional tomahawky shape, travelling along at 500 or 600 kilometres an hour above sea level with a big radar signature, you shouldn't plan on many of them getting through. What the Russians have turned to some extent, is the KH-101 missile, and a Tupolev-95, which dates from 50 or 60 years ago, in the mid-50s, can take 8 of these. They weigh 2.5 tonnes each. They've got a 5,000 kilometre range. That looks like a bit of semi-stealth shaping in the body of the missile. On the other hand, Ukraine has been able to shoot most of these down too. But it's very inspiring for us, because 5,000 kilometres is a distance from Darwin to Hong Kong. So you could have our bombers taking off from Darwin, getting a bit of altitude, launching one of these, and as long as they got past through Indonesia, you could be sniping Chinese shipping in the South China Sea and Chinese facilities within China from Darwin itself using this type of missiles. In fact, the Russians are launching these bombers from near the Kola Peninsula, one of their submarine bases up there. Got an airfield close to it. It's 2,000 kilometres down to Ukraine, and therefore the 5,000 kilometre range is wasted. So they pulled out one of the fuel tanks and put in an extra warhead, so they get 900 kilos of warhead delivered instead of just 450. There's a KH-101 shot down. If we are nice to the Ukrainians, they might lend it to us and we could reverse engineer it. Now, of interest is that the last long-range shoot down between Ukraine and Russia was the Ukrainians shooting down a Tu-22M from 308 kilometres. It was an ambush. The damaged plane could fly at another 300 kilometres before it crashed. But this is something that dates from 1967, was first in service. Of course, electronics have been updated, but these things are still useful. Now, this is a consequence of the Ukrainians not having enough artillery shells, because normally the two countries would battle it out with artillery, and if anybody trying to cross no man's land to take on the other side would be hit by an artillery barrage. But the Ukrainians didn't have enough artillery, so they've substituted FPV drones, which have been quite effective. So the Ukrainian FPV drone use forced the Russians, basically, to put extra armour on their tanks. But this is all about delivering Russian troops to the Ukrainian front line. It's not about using it as a tank. Here's a couple more designs. And you'll see that both of those have got drone jammers on their roofs. But they're only connected by tiny little wires, which means they can't throw out much power. And here's a more advanced example, which has got the steel sheeting with reinforcing mesh over the top to make the things explode at a standoff distance, with the mine rollers at the front. There's a site on the web called Andrew Petua, who's Ukrainian, who analyses daily losses on the front line between Russia and Ukraine. And this is the losses for the 13th of April, with the Russian losses on the left. This is a vertical column, and I've changed it to the horizontal so that we can fit it on one slide. And Ukrainian losses on the right. You can see there are 12 Russian tanks, 32 infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, 18 trucks and civilian. And the Russian losses are running between 3 to 8 times higher than Ukrainian losses, thankfully. The importance of barrels. War will ever remain an artillery duel, whether that's tube artillery or missile delivered artillery. So the importance of barrels. This is an artillery park in Omsk, Russia in May 2021. The 1,300 152mm howitzers there. There were none left in May 2023. The Russians can only make 150 barrels a year. They can produce 3 million shells a year of various calibers, but they can only fire eventually through the number of artillery barrels they produce each year. The Russian artillery barrel is possibly worth 2,000 shells before it blows up itself. That's speeded up by the North Korean shells that have arrived recently. But until the Russian industrial base cranks up producing barrels, it doesn't matter how many shells they produce, they can only fire about 300,000 per annum eventually. So this is their artillery losses per month. This is updated monthly by the Ukrainian Defence Force, and they're losing about 1,000 barrels a month. Tank losses on the left and helicopter losses on the right. So there is initial loss of tanks when the war started, because they're easier to hit from a distance. and that's increased recently. They're running out of tanks, and thus they're now shipping T-55s to the front. And the oldest tank seen on the battlefield is a T-54, which was first produced in 1945. The T-58s date from, the T-55s date from about 1958. You'll see from the helicopters' losses that they've dropped off. And that's because either the Russians have run out of helicopters, or it's just not worth while trying to send them to the front because it's so easy to shoot down, which is the world of the modern battlefield. There's no point in having helicopters along the front line. They can be shot down from 130 kilometres away. Certainly a Patriot battery did that in May last year. Japan has already taken this lesson to heart, so it's parked up its Apache helicopters. We're getting, and yet to get, another 29 of them. Russian personnel losses by month started out very low, rose again as their more experienced troops got chewed up, and that was actually the Wagner group in the middle there. And then more recently, they're sending virtually untrained people to the front into meat grinder attacks. They're losing about 25,000, 38,000 a month. They've lost 530,000 troops so far, total wounded and killed, and the killed is probably about a third of that, probably about 180,000 dead. Fighting vehicles losses per month. They're now resorting to buying Chinese-made golf cart type things and sending to their troops on that. And they've actually gone beyond that to using scooters, motorcycles. They haven't seen bicycles on the front yet. Electronic warfare. As I said, drones are big, and the Russians have always been good at electronic warfare, put a lot of effort into it, understand it. Unfortunately for them, they're centrally commanded, and it takes a long while for lessons to be learned and translated into new equipment, whereas the Ukrainians, they actually don't want to be prosecuted by the government after the war, so they'd rather deal privately rather than with a military direct, so that no one comes up after them with the war and says, you charged too much way back in March 2024 for these weapons which only cost you so much to make. That's their problem. But what you see on the right there is a Russian anti-drone backpack, and there's several versions of this with domes and this and that and the other, but you basically convert your whole effort into carrying that backpack into war if you want to reduce your risk of being hit by an FPV drone. It's a bit like the US aircraft carriers at the moment. Back even 30 years ago, 70% of the military effort was spent in protecting the aircraft carrier from attack rather than projecting power from the aircraft carrier. And it's just got worse these days. So this is an interesting image from the war. This is a 20-year-old Ukrainian FPV driver, was a med student. His code name is Darwin, and he is said to have killed hundreds of Russians with his FPV driving skills. That upsets the Russians a lot, actually. He's a baby-faced killer. And this is what I believe that the drone war will settle down to. Now, the analogy is from Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon in 2006, in which they thought there would be an easy walkover of Hezbollah, but Hezbollah was armed with new Russian Kornet anti-tank guided missiles with a tandem-shaped charge. And that chewed up through the Merkava tanks of the Israelis. So the Israelis developed in response active protection systems, like a Trophy from Elbit, and there's Iron Fist from Israeli Defence Industries. The Redbacks will be we're spending 600 mil to arm those things with the Trophy system. And when they did introduce them, the Israelis found that adding that anti-tank guided missile protection system added 30% to the cost of the tank. Now, as I'm not the first person to say that, but it's obvious if you just simply get your active protection system against ATGMs, which are coming in at 400 metres a second, you've got drones coming in at 15 metres a second. They're just much easier to detect by radar and plot a course against. You just expand the ability of the active protection systems to take on smaller, slower things coming in from higher angles. And then because of the troops running around, they can't carry that by themselves and remain combat effective. You'd have to have some dedicated system to fighting the drones, which may also have other utility on the battlefield. And that tries to represent the protection against the infantry fighting vehicle on the left or tank, and a larger protection from a dedicated vehicle which will have to follow several hundred metres behind. But it's similar to Australian military doctrine. We wouldn't let infantry go beyond artillery range so we could support them. So in the future, no one will be allowed to go beyond FPV range. Bear in mind these things can track you down day or night. A thermal bolometer made in China is only $30 US, and that gives you a thermal picture of the battlefield. And you can see people's limbs and everything in great detail. That's what it's come to. And this graphic tries to represent the state of the front line at the moment, with Russia on the right and Ukraine on the left. The no man's land is 5 kilometres wide. Vertical and horizontal scales are the same. So the biggest weapon the Russians have got is Iskanders, which, like ATACMS and other things, comes in at 50 kilometres high, where the air is 1,000th of the density at sea level here, and that can strike within 500, at the moment, 500 kilometres of the launch point. The Russians are trying to expand the ATACMS envelope to 1,000 kilometres, where they'll be able to hit all of Ukraine, not just the closest 500 kilometres. But what they do, the Russians and Ukrainians do, they trade artillery. Ukrainians at 155 millimetres, the longest range of those is about 40 kilometres, and the Russian 152 is about 30 kilometres. That's ideally, they're actually much the same. And then what the Russians have resorted to doing, because of their running of artillery, is getting Su-34s to launch glide bombs up to 3 tonnes, which have a range maximum of about 70 kilometres. So the Russians can be 30 kilometres from the front line launch, and they'll go another 30 kilometres odd into Ukrainian territory and hit with a fair amount of precision. So they've been doing up to 13 an hour of glide bomb attacks on the Ukrainian lines, and up to about 107 a day. And this is a big problem for the Ukrainians, which would only be countered by a SAM system a bit further back from the artillery effect, which is quite possible, but someone's got to provide them with them in the first instance. And this is what you, in my view, is what you have to do to prevail in the battle in Ukraine. The Russian and Ukrainian lines are both undermanned, actually, compared to previous battles and what they're trying to attempt. It is a trench warfare, and this is a plan view of what it looks like. The trench lines are about 5 kilometres apart. There's also mine belts, and the Russian or Soviet doctrine was to have your anti-tank mine belt 200 metres wide, and the Russians have expanded that to 500 metres. So this is the reason why the Ukrainian advance in the south failed September last year. They were trying to cross the no man's land of 5 kilometres. They would hit the mine belt. They didn't have enough mine clearing vehicles. They'd be disabled by a mine. Then that gave time for the Russians to bring up anti-tank guided missile crews from elsewhere in the front, from 30, 40 kilometres away if necessary, concentrate on that point and take out the remaining Ukrainian tanks. So the little advances of the Ukrainians last year were quite expensive in terms of men and material, and they eventually gave up on them. And the Russians thankfully responded by attacking the Ukrainians, and because you've got to cross 5 kilometres of open ground on the average, say, these days, they're easily picked off with FPV drones. The solution to SAM systems are either use decoys or ballistic missiles, preferably with a cluster warhead, as some have attacks in recent months have been in Crimea and Russian-occupied Ukraine, which are quite effective at chewing up the S-300 sites. And the solution to drones and millimetre radars are ending up with microwave or lasers. And the bottom right-hand corner, that's the latest iteration of the HARM missile just being introduced to US service. And you can see it's got a prominent chine right at the point at which the radar from the radar site, the SAM site, would be impacting on it to reduce its radar signature. I've said this before. In fact, a year ago when I gave a presentation, I said the same thing, that what Ukraine has shown is that what's best in tube artillery is wheeled, in which case it can fire a couple of rounds and then take off almost immediately afterwards and relocate. Both sides are able to do counter battery fire within 3 minutes. So you only got 3 minutes to do whatever you want to do in terms of firing shells at the enemy, and then you've got to be on your way because there'll be incoming rounds. And in March this year, the US Army came to the same conclusion: the future for tube artillery isn't bright. Ukrainian drones keep evolving, and this is one of the best ones I've seen. It doesn't have a name in the West yet, but that's a micro jet engine at the back of that thing, and you can see it's quite well constructed to reduce the amount of materials used, including that tails feature, which gets a lot of strength from having a cross member at the top. It's also on a dolly for takeoff, so you're not paying for landing gear in this drone. And you can take off an ordinary airfield, you recover the dolly and do the next one. And this is one of the best value for money drones the Ukrainians produce. That's $40,000 for that thing, 30 kilo warhead, 800 kilometre range, which means it's $1.67 per kilometre for warhead delivered. That's a pusher propeller, by the way. And this is one of the lower cost jobs the Ukrainians have produced. That orange tube is plastic plumbing pipe. They built the whole thing around that. And to have commonality, the tail structure, all those features are the same, actually the same thing, either vertical or horizontal. They've recycled plastic water bottles as their fuel tanks, and they've simply taped the warhead on. So you can produce these every day of the week, and it'll probably have a half decent range. This is a collation of the range of Ukrainian drones produced to date, including a balloon-delivered warheads. And some of the things, these have gone up to 1,100 kilometres into Russia and blown up oil refineries. A very important thing to do. On to the evolution of the FPV battle, which started in May 2022 when the Ukrainians were dropping little warheads into the sunroofs of Russian cars that they'd commandeered on the battlefield. But then it was driven by the shortage of artillery last year. So the top left-hand graph is of drone strikes on blue is the Ukrainians on the Russians, and Russians the blue on the strikes on the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians got an early lead on maintaining it. They're chewing through 50 to 100,000 drones a month. 1 in 6 drones hits a target. And at the moment, the Ukrainians, right at this moment, the Ukrainians have got a 6-to-1 advantage in drones over the Russians. And it's basically a lot of people in their garages producing these things with 3D printers and the like. But there are a couple of other battlefield laboratories on the planet. There's the Houthis that are taking all the shipping in the Red Sea, and there's the insurrection in Myanmar, where the rebels are taking on the central government, and they're doing their own thing with drones. One on the left is a big bomber type thing dropping mortars, which is bigger than anything I've seen out of Ukraine so far. And the one on the right, what you see here is bat-shaped things with a propeller at the front, and they've got enough power to take off from those steel rods that they're sitting on at takeoff. So this is a freeze frame of a video in which those are taking off one after the other. In fact, at the right, in the top right, you see the first drone that's taken off is just below the wing there. Now they'll have a high drag and so on, but you're in the jungle, it doesn't really matter because you haven't got far to go before you hit your enemy. And in terms of logistics, this is the state of Russian logistics. They're sending people to battle on electric scooters. And on the right, they're relying more upon these bukankas. Bukankas are a loaf brand. It looks like a loaf of bread, so it's nicknamed in Russia as a bukanka, which is Russian for loaf. And this is one being blessed by a Russian Orthodox priest on its way to battle. And the roads near the front lines are littered with these things because they're very easy to hit with FPV drones. They've run out of trucks, another way of saying it. There are plenty of lessons from the Ukraine war. You can read them at your leisure, perhaps. I've gone through most of them. But let's go to the high-level lessons from the Ukraine war, which are very encouraging to us, Because first of all, you don't need a navy to sink a navy. Ukrainians have driven the Russian navy 900 kilometres from the nearest Ukrainian coastline. They've now left Crimea and they're basically holed up in Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland. And they're still being hit there by the Ukrainians, by marine drones. And the Ukrainian grain trade is recovered, and it's all rosy in the garden. So, now what the Ukrainians have theorised on is you need at least 7 drones in a swarm. You do it at night, and modern ships aren't set up to interdict small craft approaching them, in that you see these latest stealth designs, they've got vertical sides all along the side, so it's very difficult for anybody to aim anything that's come within 100 or 200 metres of the vessel. If you own a jet ski, it's like to be requisitioned in their next war to be sent out interdicting the Chinese fleet. And you could drop these things in advance of the Chinese fleet. At 100 kilometres out, you would be out of range of their HQ-9 missiles, ground-to-air missiles. And the Ukrainian drones have got an average speed of 45 kilometres an hour, peak speed of 90 kilometres an hour. And with the ships, the Chinese ships are doing 30 kilometres an hour. You've got a closing speed of 70 kilometres an hour. You've only got an hour and a bit before the two forces join. And with AI these days, and being able to track radar emissions, which the Chinese would have to have on all the time to protect themselves from everything, which is, radars are also just a big beacon saying where you are and what you are, what speed you're doing, and where to hit you. So theoretically, it's very easy, just by drones alone. We've got the slide of it. Probably 250,000 US per drone, 7 of them, 1.5 mil, was it 1.8 mil odd to take out a Chinese ship worth 300 mil, with a very high chance of it succeeding. Second important lesson is you don't need an air force to stop overflight. Russia can't overfly Ukraine without being shot down. Ukrainian planes don't fly into Russia for the same reason. The SAM systems are just too good and got too long range. Unfortunately, we don't own any ourselves. But there is a solution to the problem, the fact that the Indonesians have now got a far better air force than we have at the moment. And a solution to the potential for Chinese cruise missiles being launched from H-6 bombers somewhere over the South China Sea and hitting Darwin. Other things that have come out of the Ukraine war, the Western world is now run by deranged idiots. So this is John Kerry saying everybody would feel better about Russia invading Ukraine if they didn't emit so much carbon dioxide. I'll leave that thought with you. But we've done better ourselves. Head of ASIO used to be on the National Security Committee of Cabinet, used to sit on it, but they chucked him out and he's now replaced by the climate change department head as part of the National Security Committee. So if you can think about what he might contribute and the loss of the ASIO advising that Committee of Cabinet, anyway, we're at a hole with respect to defence and we're just digging deeper by people who are completely deluded and deranged, and we'll develop that theme. But first, having figured out who your enemy is and the lessons of the most recent war, we go on to how to build your defence industrial base. We're using Russia as the example. Bottom left-hand graphic is of the Russian expenditure. It's in billions of dollars, US dollars, from the fall of the Soviet Union up to the current day, last couple of years ago. But what you see here is the Russians used to spend 20% of GDP on defence. It was basically the fruit of 10 million barrel a day of oil production. So 2 million barrel a day of oil got devoted to building their defence industrial base. Went into stockpiling an enormous amount of shells and tubes and this and that. Then there was nothing spent in the year they fell apart, then it picked up. But more recently they didn't want to go above 5% of GDP because any dollar you spend on defence is taken from somewhere else in the economy. But anyway, they did have a big industrial base, and people who worked in that industrial base were very well regarded in society. So let's take the example of what happens in a particular plant. On the right-hand side is a graph of producing ICBMs at the Krasmash plant. 40% of that is machining, and then 20% is assembly, then bits and pieces on the other. So basically, if you can do machining of lumps of metal, you're 60% of the way, or 40% of the way there, and assembly is nothing, so you're 60%, it's easy squeezy. If you've got machine tools. So this is a graphic of the relative contribution of different countries to machine tool exports in 2019. And it shows that if you want to build a defence industrial base, you'll be basically buying CNC machines from Germany and Japan. They'd make the best of them. They've got a mentality suited to making CNC machines, and they're very good at it, and others are coming up through the pack. I will say that recently the Russians have taken to scouring China for 20 to 30-year-old Japanese CNC machines. They're short of them, as we'll see in a moment in this graphic. So what that shows on the bottom left in those pie charts is the synergization of the Russian defence industry. The Russians look down their nose at Chinese machines because they just weren't as good as the Japanese or German ones. They'd rather buy Siemens machines, in fact. But that's 2,800 machines imported in 2021. By the time 2023, that was up fivefold. And 76% of those are Chinese machines now. Now, there is an Australian company called Anchor ANCA, based in Melbourne, who produces machine tools, sells about 60 countries around the world, and their machines have been incorporated in the Russian defence industry. So if you wanted to establish a defence industrial base in Australia, I'd recommend that you go and talk to Anchor about what's involved. Now, what the Russians have found, you're going from the pre-fall of the Soviet Union, where metallurgists had about 10 years of training before they could be putting together a major item of equipment, is if you have very good CNC machines, and particularly ones from Siemens, and converting a CAD drawing to instructions for the machines to make the finished part, it takes all the skill out of it. So the Russians now have imported 1,000 Ugandan women to operate on their CNC machine lines, just to put lumps of metal into the machine and take the finished product out. Now this is Ugandan. Ugandan's got an average IQ of 76, which is only 7 above retarded. And that's very encouraging for us, because it means that you don't need very intelligent people to build very high-tech equipment, including ICBMs. All you have to do is have the CNC machines. They're also importing a lot of black Africans, actually, for the front lines. Some as truck drivers and others, but others are being sent as meat grinding. So we have to build a lot of factories, actually, too. Industrial warehouses and factories are about $1,700 Aussie per square metre. If we build 200 of them, that's about 7.25 bill. We need to make a lot of things. We also, to start our industrial base, we have to let contracts, which is this current government isn't doing. You have to let contracts to get people to start and then build from there. Let's go through the force structure. Step 4. With regards to the Navy, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what size fleet you have or what they're made of, because they're so easy to sink these days. You have spending inordinate amount of effort in keeping those things afloat when they're so easy to sink from thousands of kilometres away. If we believe that of the Chinese ships, it's also true of our own. As submarines are clapped out, the oldest Collins is now coming to 30 years old, which traditionally should have been retired. We've got no way of plucking people from the ocean. Everybody assumes that everything's going to be just okie-dory. We don't sink any ships or lose any aircraft, because we'll have people floating around the ocean for weeks before they die, no way of picking them up out of the water, unless we divert a very high-value asset like a submarine to pick them up. And the solution's available within Australia, actually, as we go on another slide. So RAN has been a tale of idiocy. It's like that line from Macbeth, a tale of idiocy full of dithering and incompetence, producing nothing of significance. The Army. Every review of the Army is an excuse to cut the size of the thing. So that last review cut us down from 3 combined arms brigades just to 1. And I can't remember what thing's based, but that's 3,000 people effectively, or possibly 4,000 if they have to get all the anti-drone stuff they'll have to get, protecting a nation of 28 million. It's just out of whack. We are producing some missiles, apparently, next year. Lockheed and Raytheon But the Army structure is very self-indulgent. They only want to deal with primes, that is, the really big companies. They don't want to deal with small companies producing smaller things, because that would be just too much effort. We've got no mines and no drones, and as I say, the command structure, it's incompetence and perversion in equal measure. Regarding the Air Force, we only have light bombers, F-35 and the Super Hornets, no proper fighter aircraft. Indonesians are getting 42 Rafales and 24 F-15EX, and the combination of those two could shoot down the Australian RAAF 3 times over. Those 24 F-15EX of the Indonesians they're getting could shoot down the whole Australian Air Force by themselves. Now we obviously need strike distance, but the last lot of strike aircraft where they could carry larger bomb load or air-to-ground missiles, well, the F-111s are now buried in a pit in Ipswich. So basically what all that says is that the modern battle environment, as shown by Ukraine, where even a country without any navy can drive away one of the larger navies on the planet, means that the surface ships don't mean a great deal from here on. And the whole of the world's oceans are like the Mediterranean in World War II. You could be constantly subject to attack by ground-based aircraft, land-based aircraft. And our ADF has a metal problem. So what you see on the left there is a photo of the current class of offshore patrol vessels we're getting, the Arafura class, weighs 1,640 tonnes, crew of 40, and it's armed with a 25mm gun. And that's all it's armed with, apart from small arms, which they may or may not be allowed to have on board, as opposed to the Redback, which you see on the right, which we are getting eventually, weight of 42 tonnes, 1/40th of the weight of the Arafura class, crew of 3, which is 1/13th the crew. It's got a larger main gun with a round that probably weighs about 60% more than the rounds out of that 25mm gun. As I say, the profession of arms involves killing Australia's enemies, and the ADF, as it currently is, would rather not. And I think they'd be better off, they're more suited mentally to running drag queen story hour at a petting zoo. The Ghost Shark, which has come along recently, it's actually a good thing by the look of it. It's unarmed, that whopping great sonar panel on the side of it, just like modern submarines. These probably can pick up sounds from 1,000 to 2,000 kilometres away. And better if they direct P-8 aircraft, which means if these things are successful in a picket, coming through the Sunda Strait, for instance, it means our P-8 Orions don't have to search such a large volume of ocean to find a target. Very cost effective, potentially. And this is what we should be buying out of Darwin. It's going to be made in Darwin in order to pluck people from the ocean. So the Grumman Albatross was iteration after the Catalina in the Second World War. So therefore it's very likely to be a very seaworthy aircraft. Now, unfortunately, there's been a lot of dithering in the Navy, just decades of it. And the Collins class, the first one was in '96, and should be retiring now, the first one who came out of the Collins, being near on 30 years old. It had some major design flaws when it was built, including diesel engines that were designed to work in firefighting trucks in Sweden, and they were simply plonked into a submarine and hoped that they work or whatever, or someone got a contract or whatever. But in the next refit, which is one refit too far, now, after 30 years, they're going to be replaced by MTU diesels, which is a proper thing to do. But we could have got the Japanese Taigai class back in last decade. The Japanese have a philosophy of operating their submarines for only 20 years because they know there'll be evolution in the submarine, so they only have one refit and a 20-year life, and then they're on to the next class. So this Surya class was one that we could have signed up for almost 10 years ago, but it's now been replaced by the Taigai class. Now, I believe that the nuclear subs under AUKUS will be a very good thing, but they're some time away, and we need to replace those Collins class. And also, the cost of maintaining the Collins class will be the same cost as buying brand new Taigai class. But the people who run the ADF don't ever want to having made a mistake. So I believe that the AUKUS is quite a positive development in that, although it's much cheaper theoretically to sink enemy ships with air-launched missiles, and you can do it faster and everything. Submarines would be a very good thing to have as a backup in case that doesn't work. And in the scheme of things, for how many tens of billions of dollars, for the fate of the nation, it's a very good investment. Actually, there is a US government document, or no, actually, no, it was a RAND document that named which particular US submarines are going to be transferred to Australia. The submarine in the middle of it is a Virginia class as it sits now, and the one underneath is the Astute class out of the UK. And with the three-way nature of this agreement we've entered into with those countries, we'll probably end up with a substitute of the built in Australia of the Astute class. But in the meantime, you'll see from the timeline in the yellow line above, we're now in 2024 at the start of that yellow line, goes up to 2052 on the right. HMAS Collins is 30 years old in 2 years' time, in 26. 2032, USS Vermont is transferred to the RAN. Then we're about 10 years old and have another 20 years of life after it's sold to us at a price unknown. And then the USS Oregon, about 2035. The first new build Virginia to the RAN is in 2038. It's a Block 7, approaching about 10,000 tonnes. But it's an irony that the Yanks back in the 90s, early 90s, built the Seawolf class. They only built 3 of them because they were so expensive. They were 10,000 tonnes. So they substituted that with the Virginia class of 7,000 tonnes, which has now grown to 10,000 tonnes in weight. And we'll be getting 10,000 tonne submarines. But there's a problem with the USS, United States actually. The reason why the shipyards are behind is because they don't plan ahead, and right at the moment they're starting their Virginia class refits without having all the spares in stock at the time of the rebuild for the 10-year refits. We might have to have a big stock of parts ourselves, which will then sell to the Yanks when they run out in their shipyards because they don't stock enough themselves. Basing would help. To go back in analogy with World War II, there were about 140 submarines tied up in operated out of Fremantle any one time, at probably about 1944. 72 of them were American, and they were able to operate in the South China Sea because of their size. But if they all refueled at Potshot in Exmouth Gulf on the way north, and that gave them an extra 1,000 kilometres of range. We don't have any basing there at the moment up in Exmouth Gulf, so anywhere north where we can refuel our submarines and give them an extra 1,000 kilometres of range, which equates to 1,000 tonnes of weight of the submarine. On the east coast, there is a new naval base at Lombrom in New Guinea, which the Yanks and ourselves will be associated with, which those diesel submarines and anything else can refuel on their way to the South China Sea. There's a photo of a Sea Baby drone, menace of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. And as said here in early 2024, they built 35 of these for $8 million US, which is 230,000 each, basically US. And this is the range of drones that the Ukrainians have built, and a couple of Russian drones in the bottom right-hand corner. The Taiwanese have taken the Black Sea experience to heart, so this is an example of a drone they've built, which in theory they could launch from the east or west coast of Taiwan into the incoming Chinese invasion fleet and play merry havoc with them at night. The problem of shore bombardment, to put this into context, back in World War II, the most effective vessel for affecting US landings in the Pacific was actually this class of vessel, the landing ship medium rocket, which in a concentrated half hour could fire more weight of projectiles against the enemy on shore, the Japanese on shore, compared to the battleships. And this is the reason why the commander of the Japanese force in Okinawa didn't defend the beach, because he knew that he'd lose most of his troops in a futile exit, so he put them up in the hills where they'd have a better advantage against the Americans. So the Americans took this to heart and they developed the Zumwalt class destroyer, about 13,000 tonnes, and it was to have 155mm artillery on the front deck, which would fire a shell 110 kilometres, and that shell only contained 11 kilos of high explosive in it. And they built this first couple of ships in the series, and then went to build the artillery shells for it, and found they cost $800,000 each US. They're flinging houses in the landing and only delivering 11 kilos of high explosive in a shell, of course. So they stopped the line short at 3 from 20, and they're now replacing the front gun decks with missiles, actually hypersonic missiles. On to the army. When I said it's incompetence and perversion in equal measure, what you see on the left there is a captain in the Australian Army based in Darwin who asked his superiors if he could turn up to work in a dress rather than the normal male uniform. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking just because a bloke wants to turn up to work in a dress doesn't necessarily mean that he thinks he's a woman trapped in a man's body. Which would be quite bad if it was, because that's called gender dysphoria, and it's the worst mental illness to have, with a 50% suicide rate. So he might look pretty in that dress, which is on the right-hand side, which is a female uniform of the Australian Army, with a bit of lippy. He might look pretty, and he might think he's pretty, but he could very well be highly depressed. Now, the trouble with this is, amongst other things, that none of his people underneath him, or anybody else in Darwin, can take him seriously. And thus the Australian Army now has a recruitment problem, because people aren't re-signing, because they don't want to have to salute a bloke wearing a dress. It's not what the Army's about. Okay, if it's not gender dysphoria, there's other mental disease that could be. So we looked it up online, and it could be transvestic fetishism, which our High Command is encouraging amongst our troops. And it's not just us. This is a course taught by a lecturer at West Point on uniform perspectives, the evolution of cross-dressing in the military. The trouble is, we rely upon the US for a lot of our protection. Implications of the infamous Brereton report was a few years ago now, but it was 453 pages. I read it on the day it came out, because I know that was the time you have to read it, otherwise you won't get round to reading the whole thing. Bear in mind that Brereton, who wrote it, padded it out. He called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea a war crime, for instance. But we'll deal with this, it's worth dealing in detail in this. So, the Brereton report quotes Dr. Krompovitz, who said in a report that she wrote for the High Command, because our High Command has a great demand for these sort of things, that after squirters would deal with, special forces, that is Australian special forces, would cordon off a whole village, taking the men and boys to guest houses, which are typically on the edge of a village. They would be tied up and tortured by special forces, sometimes for days. When the special forces were left, the men and boys would be found dead, shot in the head, or blindfolded with throats slit. Now, this was believed by our High Command. They paid Dr. Krompovitz to write a report. They accepted it. It's there on page 120. I seemingly am the only person in Australia who's read the whole report and knows of this passage. But the implication of this is that our High Command believes this stuff about their own troops, which means they don't know their own troops. They've got no grip on reality otherwise. In fact, Brereton didn't get the answers he wanted in his report until he started paying Afghans to tell them, which isn't a advisable way of getting evidence. Now on to the fantasy fiction of Dr. Krompovitz, or to continue it. It's a small literary niche. The Army High Command's need for lurid stories of just how beastly Australian Special Forces are. Unspeakably beastly. But she got paid $6 million over a few years, according to Dutton when he was Defence Minister a couple of years ago. She also goes on that she wrote a report that officers were required to blood troops with an initiation, had to shoot a prisoner, and then they'd cover it up by planting a weapon on him and so on. And Brereton lived in a fantasy world himself in which the NCOs were really nasty people. The officers were sort of living saints who couldn't do a thing wrong, not even think a bad thought, but the NCOs were tyrants who run a code of silence to stop these stories from coming out. That's why he couldn't find them. He knew they existed. This was a bloody experience, supposedly. Several thousand Australian troops rotated through Afghanistan, and in the Brereton report, they didn't cite a single incident of such a bloodying ritual. Single case. Now, there are other sorts of, beyond perversions, there are more normal psychoses that our High Command has. And this is the story of the taipans. We had 45 of these. It dates back to John Howard. We had a choice between the Black Hawks and these taipans. And Airbus told Howard they would give him $1 billion worth of offsets. So we signed up for these things from Airbus. Trouble is, it was one of Airbus's first helicopters in this, and they didn't make them right. They didn't really work properly. Other countries have operated them successfully, but other countries have also had problems with it. Anyway, our Army Aviation was unable to operate them happily. They'd rather have Apaches, I think, or something else. Anyway, we had 45 of them. Second-hand, they're worth about $20 million each, which is $900 million total. And when the Army Aviation finally got their way and said, get rid of them, we want new American stuff, they plucked the rotors off and then buried them in a pit. Now, I can't tell you where the pit is, but they've already been destroyed. The opportunity was to either park them up, as you normally do with operating military equipment, with all their spares, and I've done the sums on that. And it was probably about $26 million to build a shed to stick them in out in the desert, and they'll be operable for decades afterwards. Or you give them to Ukraine, who could still use them. Anyway, they buried them in a pit. So I looked up that in terms of psychological problems, and you would call that an antisocial personality disorder driven by spitefulness and malicious compliance. And everybody in the system, up to the Prime Minister, is complicit to this. They just let it happen. 900 million down the drain. Our generation may be shocked by this, but seemingly there are other people who are quite happy to waste 900 mil. Another sign of the moral rot in the ADF. So on the left there, you South Koreans have gone gangbusters developing a family of tactical missiles. The Yanks stopped them from developing anything with range beyond 300 kilometres for a number of years because they didn't want to upset the North Koreans. But when that was lifted, they went gangbusters, and they're building 10,000 of various ranges and sizes and warheads, propulsion systems. On the right was a recent headline about Australia as forces that we want to re-educate their dogs to be culturally sensitive. So that's an indication of how two different countries are run. It doesn't reflect well on us by comparison. And the rot continues. Former Army chief, that's not a photo of him, that's the bloke who's just stepping down, Angus Campbell. But David Morrison, when he was Army chief, had a predilection for wearing women's shoes in public, or at least use any excuse to wear women's shoes in public. And when he retired, Deloitte gave him 200 grand a year as a consulting job on diversity, equity and inclusion. He's gone, but Angus Campbell wanted to strip veterans of Afghanistan of all their medals, but he would keep his medal, a Distinguished Service Cross for leading troops in battle. Now, he was 1,900 kilometres away in Dubai when he supposedly earned this medal, but unearned valour is very jealous of people who earn their bravery medals in the old way, which is actual bravery in combat. But he's left a very bad legacy in the ADF. And his wife was given a job, 200,000 to 400,000 a year, by the Foreign Affairs under Penny Wong, because they all piss in each other's pockets in Canberra, and they knew which side Angus Campbell was on. That's also effectively a way of giving him a bit extra in retirement by giving his wife a job in something nonsensical. Now, there's another reason to put adults back in charge of the Defence Department. They actually think that they can do something about climate, and thus us and the UK have a joint commitment to fight climate using our defence forces. Instead of the Chinese, fight climate first. So my take on that is, if worshipping the weather gods is your religion, that's fine to a point, but if you think that that applies to the real world, you're delusional. And you can't be trusted on any subject. Okay, here's another sign of the rot, and I don't think I've run out yet. Brigadier and above ranks relative to other troops, other ranks. So a brigade, which a brigadier runs a brigade, is normally about 3,000 troops. In the UK, they've got 1,200 other ranks compared to each brigadier class and above. In the US, it's better, it's more professional, 1,500. But Australia, we only got 260. 4 or 5 times higher than as needed compared to properly run militaries. And that's because nobody has taken an interest in defence for the last 30, 40 years. The bureaucracies run amok. They just make themselves comfortable and promote each other and all that. Okay, there's probably the last slide on the right, but it took a Green senator, Pocock, from I don't know what state she's from, who asked the ADF, why do you have so many consultants and what do they do? And the numbers came out of defence. There's 1,891 consultants from the big 4 accounting firms who have yellow passes. They're virtually full-time in Russell Hill. Now, God knows what they all do, but that's probably $1 billion a year just to pay for those people. And you could stand up a combined arms brigade with the money wasted on this stupidity. So as I say in the bottom, there's big money involved in achieving nothing and being hopeless. Now the consequences making your troops salute blokes wearing dresses is that the re-recruitment rates, retention rates in the ADF are now very low indeed. So they're 4,000 troops short now. So their solutions are to axe health entry requirements, relax the mental health requirements, well that's obviously obvious, and allow recruits from foreign nations. So what they don't understand is that unit cohesion goes out the door. That why you train troops together in a company is that they all will fight to the death for each other. You're not going to fight to death for some of these mentally impaired people you can virtually understand speak. There is a solution, and it happened before once in Australian history. Back on the 13th of August 1940, an RAF Hudson bomber took off from Melbourne, tried to land in Canberra, crashed 2 kilometres short of the runway. The 10 on board were killed, including the Chief of the General Staff, the Defence Minister, a couple of other notables, which meant all those people had to be replaced, which they did. And Australia's conduct of the war improved dramatically afterwards. We were noticeably bad at operating. Solution here is some aircraft will have to be a 737 at least to take off and crash short of Canberra Airport. We get new people to run the Defence Department, because right at the moment it's been captured by a clack, or whatever the correct pronunciation is, of self-perpetuating clack of social justice warriors who only appoint people like themselves, and thus you can expect the Admiral, appointed now to replace Angus Campbell, to be of the same ilk and waste the same amount of money on the same pet topics. And reform will only be achieved by a decapitation event. There is some equality amongst the dross. This is the flight track of a RAF wedgetail over Lvov, Western Ukraine, up along the border on the 21st of March, just about after midnight, and it's tracking Russian cruise missiles coming in to attack Lvov. So it can do some things. And bear in mind the wedgetail operates in the L-band, and theoretically you can detect stealth aircraft. I could read that into leisure. Same. Just want to say that the redback we're getting is the same weight as the main Russian battle tank, 42 tonnes. It's grown a lot from the M113 back in the 70s. We had about 830 M113s Australia bought in the 60s, and they were due to be replaced with 1,100 redbacks from 2004, but that's now shrunk to 129. Air Force, what has Fat Amy been up to? Well, Fat Amy is the nickname of the USA Air Force pilots for the F-35, and the F-35 is now choking in its own spaghetti code, because when the thing was built way back, the first flight in 2006, they mixed up the software for the avionics with the weapon system. So every time you make a change in the aircraft, you've got no idea what the interactions are. And right at the moment they're trying to achieve technical refresh 3. And the US Air Force, which has still got a whole lot of bugs in it, and as in a slide further on says, sometimes they have to reboot in mid-flight their whole software package that runs the plane. You can imagine how inconvenient that might be. So the US Air Force said, we're not taking any more from the production line until you fix this problem. So now 100 F-35s are parked up in some secret facility near Fort Worth, waiting to be fixed before the US Air Force will take them. Now, you might think that stealth aircraft and things that are low observable are an exclusive club. Well, that's grown a bit because 3 countries have tried to make their own stealth aircraft now. On the left is a Korean Air Force effort, the KF-21 Boromei, which the Koreans have nicknamed the Raby Raptor because all those 3 efforts look like copies of the F-22. And the Turks made the closest copy to what actually the F-22 looks like. They should have copied their YF-23, of course. Just want to state that stealth isn't binary, it's not on-off. On the right-hand side is the relative returns of the F-35 at different bands in the radar spectrum. So the bottom right-hand corner is the X-band for targeting and so on. The F-35 is only stealthy in a narrow cone around its nose. It lights up like an ordinary aircraft around the sides. Bear in mind the F-22 by comparison is full stealth all around the aircraft. And I'm not the only person saying that the F-35 is a dog. There's a distinguished aviation journalist by the name of Bill Sweetman who's just written this book, although it's more like a booklet, it's 80 pages. And one of the person who bought it complained he'd only got 80 pages for $35 US outlay. But he argues in that 80-page pamphlet that the F-35 is a failure. And having 30 years of experience, the last decades are spent with Aviation Week, he would know. F-35 mission capable rates are still falling actually from their recent peak in 2020, now up to 2023. As I said, the F-35s are piling up on the tarmac and they're forced to reboot in mid-air. They're 50,000 hours to make an F-35 and 4,000 hours of that is rework because they're so difficult to make. The innards are packed tighter than a head of cabbage. And so you damage parts trying to put them in. And that rework rate actually hasn't dropped even after almost 2 decades of experience building the thing. By comparison, from memory, I think the Spitfire took 5,000 hours to make in World War II and the Hurricane 3,000 hours. And this is an important graphic in that this shows on the right-hand side that line rising up is military aircraft developed for the US DoD in terms of how many years they spent in development versus the date they were introduced. And it's a straight line relationship from when the F-15 started in the mid-70s. As opposed to commercial aircraft, it still takes about 5 or 6 years to build, design and build. And automotives, the cycle rate's down to about a year. You can design and build and get one out the door within a year. But military aircraft, it's sort of ground to a stop. And then some budget considerations with our own beloved RAAF. In that the budget for this year, we've got 63 F-35s. It's supposed to cost 526 mil. Now they've stated they've reduced flying hours on the F-35 to 30 an hour a month. They need 20 for competency in flying the thing, but they've only got a certain budget, so they cut the hours and hope for the best. And that works out to 53,000 Aussie an hour, as opposed to, this from their figures, 36 Super Hornets costing almost the same amount of money, or more actually. 15 million per aircraft per annum, and per hour of 96,000 Aussie. Now, you can believe that we have a worse expend rate than the Yanks on running aircraft when they're only half that for the Super Hornet. But I can't believe that we would fly the F-35 more cheaply than the Yanks might. And I think that's it for today. And thank you very much for your attendance and time. Kind audience.
Thank you, David. Careful, you don't sit